Rome, 63 BC. Lucius Sergius Catilina has just lost his third bid at the consulship in the last 4 years. Denied by the voters again, he begins to devise a plan, a coup d'etat, that, if successful, will end with him and his followers in control of the Roman Republic. Now, Catiline was born into the ancient patrician family of the gens Sergia, which had quite the illustrious family history throughout the years of the Republic. Though no ancestor of his had held the consulship since 429 BC, back in 380 BC, a couple of the family members had served on the consular tribunate, while his uncle, in 105 BC, was elected praetor, and back during the famous Second Punic War, his great-grandfather had been a praetor as well. So he does come from a pretty distinguished family, even if the past couple decades have seen them fall from grace a little bit. His father would actually be considered poor amongst the wealthy aristocratic families of Rome, but don't get me wrong, he came from a clan that was much, much wealthier than the average Roman family. In the Social War, which was a 4-year-long war between Rome and its Italian allies, Catiline actually served under the father of the famous Pompey the Great, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo. He married one of Gaius Marius's nieces, but in the civil war between Marius and Sulla, he actually joined the Sullans and served as a lieutenant. And it's actually said that during those Sullan proscriptions was when he became a very wealthy man. Some ancient sources even claim that he had his own brother and 2 brother-in-laws killed so that he could collect their fortunes. But some other historians think that this could just be Ciceronian slander against him. Catiline served as praetor himself in the year 68 BC, and for the 2 years after his praetorship, he was pro-praetorian governor of Africa, and it was during those years he got married for a second time, this time marrying the wealthy and beautiful Aurelia Aristilia. After Africa, it was upon his return home to Rome that his first bid at a consulship was rejected by a magistrate. Now, Cicero claims it's because Catiline had a trial for extortion coming up that year, but other sources claim that this rejection could possibly just be because the year before, the 2 consuls who had been elected had actually been convicted of bribery, and then deposed from the consulship. So the next year's elections, which Catiline was denied from even entering, his denial could have just been the Senate wanting to be fair to the candidates who had lost the year before, and because he wasn't one of them, he wasn't allowed to run. But either way, his first go at a consulship did not go well. Now, this is when the so-called First Catiline Conspiracy took place. Nowadays, though, most historians will say that this event was probably fictitious, and that it never really actually happened. What it is, though, is apparently Catiline conspired with the 2 men who had just been deposed from the office, and they were going to take back the consulship by force, and possibly Catiline himself would have taken over one of those consulships. But the supposed day of the coup came and went with no incident, and like I said before, most, if not all, Roman historians agree that this is probably just a made-up event. Later, in that same year though, he was actually brought up on extortion charges from when he was governor of Africa, but the prosecution, which was led by Publius Clodius Pulcher, had a very tough time, because multiple former consuls and high-ranking men actually came to the defense of Catiline. And in the end, out of a jury made up of senators, equites, and tribuni aerarii, only the senators voted for conviction, while the other 2 groups voted for acquittal. And Catiline was off the hook. Moving into the year 64 BC, Catiline had his candidacy for the consulship accepted, and actually had his campaign paid for by none other than the famous Julius Caesar, and the infamous Crassus, who would give him large sums of money to bribe people, of course. But even with the help of the 2 richest men at the time, Catiline lost again. Cicero easily beat Catiline and his ally Gaius Antonius Hybrida. Hybrida actually just squeaked out the victory over Catiline. That year, Julius Caesar and Cato the Younger were actually going after the loans that were given out during the civil war of Marius and Sulla, as well as looking to go after some of the beneficiaries of Sulla's proscriptions. So that could have been a pretty big reason or a cause as to why some people didn't vote for Catiline and why he ended up losing. And again, after these elections, he was brought up on charges of murdering people during the proscriptions. But with his connections, again, he was acquitted. Now, that year, things between the two former factions of Sulla and Marius continued to grow more and more tense. Cicero actually fought against a proposal that would repeal the benefits received by the sons of the victims of all the proscriptions, because he knew that it would actually just cause way too much turmoil between the ruling class. And with another consular election approaching, Catiline readied himself for another campaign. This time, he'd be taking on three major candidates: Decimus Junius Silanus, Lucius Licinius Murena, and Servius Sulpicius Rufus, with Cicero supporting Sulpicius, which really did hurt Catiline's chances at getting elected. And it was during these elections that Cicero claims that Catiline went around promising everything and anything to anybody, even claiming that he said he would kill the rich and redistribute the wealth, and that he would abolish all existing debts and even propose land reform. Now, to the extent that these claims are true isn't fully known, but we can be sure that there was definitely some demagoguery going on. But it didn't matter, as Catiline lost the election again, and it was after this last defeat that Catiline seems to have lost all his money and been abandoned by the likes of Julius Caesar and Crassus. It was at this time Catiline must have come up with his idea that if they wouldn't give him what he wanted, then he'd just have to take it, and that he knew there was other men out there that would join him. Publius Cornelius Lentulus, a former consul who was kicked out of the Senate for immorality; Gaius Cornelius Cethegus, a Sertorian sympathizer; Publius Atronius Pietus, a former consul who had his victory disallowed and kicked out of the Senate because of bribery charges; and many other men who felt as if they had been snubbed by the Senate or their careers stalled and denied advancement, as well as the two main group of Manlius's army, which we'll get to that in a second. Poor farmers and ex-Sullan veterans looking to make a quick paycheck, and anyone else who possibly felt they had something to gain from a Catilinarian victory over the Senate. Cicero first heard rumors of a plot in the fall of 63 BC, apparently from a woman named Fulvia, but the very first actual evidence of something going on behind the scenes was when Marcus Licinius Crassus, yes, that one, handed over some letters to Cicero that showed a plan to have prominent citizens killed, as well as a lot of influential Senate members. And then days later, the Senate received a report that stated armed men were gathering in Etruria, where a former ex-Sullan centurion by the name of Gaius Manlius was leading these men, and some historians think that Gaius's revolt was actually a separate rebellion, and that Catiline joined in with them at the last-ditch effort when he had nowhere else to go. But there's more historians believe that Gaius and Catiline were actually conspiring together all the way from the start, as Gaius was a supporter of Catiline's consulship bids. Now, when the letters and reports of armed men came in, the Senate declared tumultus, a state of emergency, and when the reports of Gaius Manlius arrived, the Senate passed Senatus Consultum Ultimum, giving the two consuls the authority to do whatever they seemed fit to handle the situation. Now, even though Catiline, he was named in the first letters that Cicero received from Crassus, he actually stayed in the city, because to him, some random anonymous letters, they were sufficient enough evidence to prove his guilt, at least in his opinion. But after letters coming from Etruria and Manlius that decisively connected him to the uprising, he was indicted for public violence. After that, it was on the night of November 6 that Catiline held a secret meeting at the house of Marcus Porcius Laeca, where he detailed his plan to go and join up with Manlius, and that the other conspirators, should head to the other little revolts all around Italy at the time, and try and take charge of those, as well as coming up with the plan that 2 men would go and assassinate Cicero the next day. But the next day came, and the 2 men found that Cicero's house was shut up and locked down against them. And later that day, Cicero actually gathered together the Senate on November 7th, 63 BC. He gave his first speech denouncing Catiline and publicly announcing the conspiracy. Catiline, who was actually present at that Senate meeting, attempted to tell the Senate that, you know what, I'll just go into exile if you'll all allow it. But Cicero then shut that down and refused to allow the option of exile. Then Catiline tried to claim his innocence and to defend his honor. He even actually called Cicero a squatter, insulting his ancestry. But he was thoroughly rebuked and shouted down by the gathered senators. After this, he claimed that he was going to leave the city in a voluntary exile to spare his country from a civil war. He then returned home to write a letter telling his friend Quintus Lutatius Catilinus, Catulus Capitolinus, what a baller name, to protect and care for his wife. He then left the city of Rome on the road to Massilia. But he stopped to gather weapons in Etruria, and once he did that, he diverted his path to join up with Manlius and his army near Faesulae. And of course, when the Senate found that out, they declared both Catiline and Manlius enemies of the state. It was at this time that Publius Cornelius Lentulus Sura and his plot to bring the Allobroges tribe to help support the Catilinarians. It came to light, and the Allobroges, they actually double-crossed Lentulus, and they told Cicero of the plan. And with their help, Cicero was able to find 5 men in the city who were a part of the conspiracy: Lentulus, Cethegus, Satilius, Gabinius, and Caparius, I believe. These men were arrested and put on house arrest until the Senate could determine what to do with them. And just a little bit of a side note here, there was actually an informant who tried to implicate Crassus in part of this conspiracy. But he wasn't believed, and he was actually thrown in jail himself, so sucks to be that guy. It was after a failed attempt at freeing those prisoners that the Senate called for a meeting and a debate over what was to happen with the conspirators. This meeting was held at the Temple of Concord. Cicero called on the senators in order of seniority, and they began to all speak in favor of the death penalty. Until Julius Caesar, yeah, that guy again, spoke in favor of life imprisonment. Cicero, feeling the tide shifting towards the more lenient Caesar, tried to interrupt and give a speech denouncing that option, but it did seem like the crowd was leaning much more towards leniency. That is, until the man we know of today as Cato the Younger stepped up. Cato is said to have risen and given a speech not only denouncing the conspirators, but denouncing Caesar as well, going so far as to claim that he was actually in league with them. He also railed against his fellow senators for being so soft and lenient against these traitors, and for failing to be as strict and harsh with their punishments like the way their ancestors would. And with that, Cato's speech carried the day. Now, without trials, these men's executions were carried out with the Senate ratifying Cicero's actions after the act. And when the sentencing was done, Cicero was said to have claimed just a simple, "They have lived." And his fellow senators hailing him as Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland. When the news of these executions reached Catiline and his men, A large group of them actually melted away, leaving Catiline with maybe about 3,000 men left, and with an escape into Gaul cut off by Quintus Metellus Celer, the proconsul of Cisalpine Gaul, actually. He had nowhere to run, and on January 3rd, 62 BC, he turned his army south to face Antonius and his men. Now, there's not much on the actual battle itself, most likely because it was probably more of a slaughter than a battle for the outnumbered Catilinarians. Marcus Petritius, a lieutenant, punched through Catiline's center with a praetorian cohort, forcing some of his men to flee, but Catiline and his die-hard supporters fought with bravery and skill all the way until the very end, until they were overwhelmed and completely destroyed. They fought so hard, as they knew that they were going to be killed anyways, and were desperate men, who really actually didn't really want to even survive their defeat. An account in Sulla reads, "When the battle was ended, it became evident what boldness and resolution had pervaded Catiline's army. For almost every man covered with his body, when life was gone, the position which he had taken when alive at the beginning of the conflict. A few, indeed, in the center, whom the praetorian cohort had scattered, lay a little apart from the rest, but the wounds, even of these, were in the front. Catiline himself was found far in advance of his men, amid a heap of slain foemen, still breathing slightly, and showing in his face the indomitable spirit which had animated him when he was alive." And that is the story of Catiline and his rebellion. Or is it? For a long, long time, Catiline and his actions were viewed by people through the eyes of his enemies. Cicero himself, during the trials of a friend who was accused of being a co-conspirator, is actually said to have given high praise to Catiline, that he was a good leader and very adept at motivating people, a good general and very, very sociable, and that's actually why so many men were willing to join him. Some might tell you they think that this whole affair is actually made up, and that's purely a Ciceronian invention, framing Catiline for the advancement of his own political career. And some may think that the rebellion was incited on purpose by the Senate and Cicero, so that they could purge all the supporters of, or would-be supporters of Pompey, who they feared that after he returned from a victorious Third Mithridatic War, would follow in the footsteps of Sulla. And some look at Catiline as just a precursor to Julius Caesar, and that he was fighting against senatorial corruption. But, however you think of Catiline and his so-called conspiracy, it would be quite interesting to learn that Caesar was actually in on this plot, and that he used Catiline as a sort of trial run to see what could be done, and that he learned what he needed for when he, just years later, would make his own bid for power. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good one.